Okay, for those joining us, this is the Nerd Street Creative Track. We have writing, we have creative business, we have game development, we have all of that. It's all of the cool creative stuff that runs our businesses and real professionals here talking about it. And everything is recorded at the end of this session. Your guide today, Justin Rose, will be able to give you a QR code that is going to give you access to all of the Creative Track videos that will have been recorded this weekend. This is a really cool thing that Nerd Street does. And don't forget that all of our authors and professionals who do come up here to present with you, they are stepping away from their booth to do that. So give them some love down in the vendor hall later. This is recorded and you can get all of these videos later. Don't worry, you won't be on the video unless you step in front of the camera and say hi, Mom. With that, I'm going to turn it over to a professional whose editing workshop I have had the opportunity of sitting in a few times. This is Justin Rose of Self-Editing for Impact. And you can just bring that back to me. You can make your way back down the hall.
Hey guys, feel free, if you haven't grabbed one, there's some handouts on the back table there that will kind of follow along with what we're covering, and there's also some pencils there if you need them. So there's a few different approaches to editing, a few different types of editing that take place at different stages of the process. What we're going to cover is kind of the first or second stage editing. Your very first brush might be to restructure, do big changes to add in scenes or to rearrange timelines or something. We're not talking about that, but we're kind of talking about the first stage of final editing, where you're like, okay, I have everything set up basically how I want. Everything's flowing according to the plot, all of my pieces are in place, and now I want to work on fine-tuning the mechanics and making the prose sing, making the perspective clear, making the emphasis and themes stand out, and emotional beats. After that, you would get down to things like, trimming your word count, cutting out excess fat. Then you would, after that, probably get down to the really nitty-gritty of fixing all of your grammar, looking for every single individual typo, little line edit, stuff like that. But the part we're going to focus on is that second portion mentioned, where you're focused on working on making the prose emphasize what you want, making your themes and points and characters stand out. I used to do slush reading for a journal, like a literary journal, and it was just a free journal, so a lot of people submitted, and it was a very wide range of quality, and often enough you could read one paragraph and just know, okay, this is going nowhere. The issues you would see would be like extremely staccato or perfunctory or flat sentences, the same structure over and over and over, things that were clunky or just a whole bunch of extra words that weren't needed, a lot of nominalizations where you're taking your verbs and turning them into nouns and making the sentence just kind of languish. A lot of issues like that will stand out very quickly, and you might not be able to identify exactly what's causing it, but a very common cause is simply that the sentence emphasizes the wrong thing. And if you can figure out what makes a sentence or paragraph emphasize on different elements, as soon as you fix that issue, I think you'll find that a lot of the other things like the staccato-ness or the dragging or issues like that will kind of sort themselves out as they follow your choice of emphasis. So if a paragraph or sentence lags or flounders, ask yourself, okay, what is the emphasis of this paragraph? What do I want it to emphasize? And are those the same thing? So to rewrite a sentence or paragraph, I'm going to start with these two steps. You can find a focal point in the section, the element that you want to emphasize. There are so many different things that might be, depending on what sort of paragraph it is. If it's a paragraph of description and you want a particular element of the surroundings to stand out, well, that's going to be your emphasis point. If it's an emotional scene where characters undergo a lot of inner turmoil, you might key in on their thought, or you might key in on their emotion. So all depending on what sort of paragraph it is, you might pick any one of a number of different elements to emphasize. We'll talk more about why you would pick specific things in the second half of this discussion. And in the first half of this discussion, we'll talk about how you emphasize them. So naturally, through prose, is kind of an overall heading for a few different methods, but all using prose to make the difference. The two most impactful parts in a sentence are always going to be the very beginning and the very end. The element that begins it is what's going to trigger your brain to fire first. It's what you're going to key in on, and it's going to trigger you to think about it the most at the outset because you're adjusting yourself, orienting yourself. And this is true at multiple levels. It's true at the level of the sentence, the paragraph, the chapter, the book, the series. If you think of book series you like, it is very, very common that the universally best loved will be the first or the last. And usually the middle ones are kind of less memorable. And it's largely because when you enter a new world and you're adjusting in that first book, you're learning about the characters, you're engaged, all of your neurons are firing because you need that attention to gather up all the details that are going to sustain you throughout the rest of the work. And when you get to the end, you have all of that behind you, and that last element is what's going to be the last thing you're exposed to, so it's going to be the most recent for you, it's going to be what lingers and stays in your mind. So at every level, sentence, paragraph, chapter, book, series, you want to know that the first and the last are the heaviest points of emphasis. I'm just going to look through my notes here really quick, make sure I didn't miss any thoughts, because I wasn't really watching them while I spoke. Yeah, so a good example is The Wheel of Time. It's 14 books long, and you think about which books hang in your memories. And for most people, if you're familiar with that series at all, I go to that one because it's a pretty well-known one, but if you're familiar with the series at all, the first book you're introduced to a bunch of teenager characters who are kind of undergoing local level hijinks, and the people who are the big bads of that book eventually become not quite commonplace, but almost commonplace throughout the rest of the series as you're exposed to them more and you see things that are higher and grander. But that first book sticks in your mind because you're adjusting to the world. You're learning this environment, this little local village. You're making friends with the characters who you're going to be with for 14 books. And then when you get to the end, the last book also sticks because you have 14 books of character growth, of investment. You have all the emotions that you've just been building up over all these books that are now finally given their catharsis and their release, and all of the narrative threads come back together. And because you don't read anything after that, because that's where you stop. It's the most recent memory, it's the most lively memory. So again, most of what we're going to be looking at here is sentence and paragraph level stuff, but it's very true at the macro series level as well. One way to add emphasis to something is brevity. And you'll often hear writing teachers talk about varying sentence length. And this is particularly where this brevity comes into play is for sentences. So Hemingway talks about the juste mot. It's a French phrase for just the right word. He believed in shaving off everything, whittling everything down, so that where one word could suffice for 3, you used 1. Where 3 could suffice for 10, you used 3. And because every single word was chosen as just the right word, it carried the most weight on each individual element. Because of this, Hemingway's prose hits very hard. If you read him, every sentence kind of feels like a hammer fall. Every paragraph feels like it has a lot of weight behind it, because he's intentionally putting as much as he can into each individual word and shaving away everything else. So by the time you finish reading one of his novels, let's say it's 70,000 words, you're going to feel like you read a novel that's 120, because his style is to shave off those 50,000 and suffice for the full 120 with the 70. That's not the only way to do it. Something that I really enjoy doing with brevity is if you can create a long suspensive sentence where you have a rhythm of dependent phrases each building on each other. Like let's say you have a whole bunch of elements in your paragraph that you want to explore. If you're able to cut every sentence down into a dependent phrase so that each element isn't its own thought, but is instead just kind of cycling in on itself, it creates a rhythm that the reader accustoms to, and then you hit them right at the end with a sudden, really brief sentence. And then because it's at the end, because it's briefer, that sentence is going to hit a lot harder. And so that's my favorite way of using brevity for impact. There are a lot of other things people do with it, like if they've got a bunch of standard length paragraphs going through, it's all you kind of expect in the style you're reading, you're adjusted to it, and then like have a 1-sentence paragraph. Well, that jars you, it stops you in your tracks because it's different and it's shorter and it's quick and it hits. I've seen some books do very drastic versions of this where they might have a chapter that's just one sentence. If you do things like that, it can feel very gimmicky unless you use it extraordinarily sparingly and really, really care about that particular thing. Like it's gotta be extraordinarily important before that level of playing with it can be justified. So you want to be careful with gimmicks like that, but again, it's another way of using brevity. It's another way of using a shifted length to add emphasis to a particular element. So here's an example of that suspensive structure. A man sat beside the river on an October day. He was fishing. The oak beside him rustled with wind. It was cold, even for October, and the fish showed little interest in biting. The man was almost ready to give up. That paragraph had a lot of information, and it doesn't sound awful, but it's very bland. There's nothing that stands out, nothing emphasized. If I read a story about this man and he was going through an emotional struggle, I might choose that the focal point of the paragraph is that last sentence about how close he is to giving up. If I'm writing a story that this is just a passing passage in, I might emphasize the description, I might emphasize the setting, help the world building, get you more immersed. But let's say I want to emphasize what the man is feeling, the internal thought. Let's try rewriting. Derek tightened his coat against a wind that was cold even for October, a wind that made the oak tree beside him shiver and seemed to have driven all the fish into hiding, no matter what baits he spiked on his hook, no matter how he jigged them or let them rest in the icy stream. He wanted to give up. So this is, instead of the 5 or 6 sentences from the previous paragraph, this is 2 sentences. The first one, every phrase is dependent, it builds with just a comma. The phrases essentially either replace the previous one as in a positive and then build on that replacement through description, or they merely modify what came before, but they are all rhythmic. You can almost feel like a surf coming into a shore or receding at each one of those comma breaks. And then you get to the end and there's a sudden paragraph or a sudden period, full stop, and you have a very brief active sentence. And that puts all the emphasis and weight and meaning on the paragraph on that last sentence. Another way that you can add emphasis, aside from the brevity thing, is a sharp departure in style, rhythm, or vocabulary. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received, for good or evil, in the superlative degree of comparison only. So there's 2 very wildly different styles there. You have an extraordinarily poetic, repetitive portion at the beginning, which has this self-contradictory, insistent, repetitive pattern that we follow of it was this, it was the antithesis, it was this, it was the antithesis, and you keep on building that pattern, and then you hit that M dash, and all of a sudden the style changes, you're basically reading a textbook. It's this technical language, this straightforward style, this professorial tone, and because of that shift, you are going to pay a lot of attention to that second portion. You're going to suddenly go, okay, what happened? Why did he change? Why am I all of a sudden being lectured to? And that style shift accomplishes the same thing as brevity. It's a break in your expectation. It's a movement away from the norm. And a danger of this is that if you use something like this too much, it may make your voice inconsistent. So you perhaps want to avoid using this one multiple times in the same chapter or something, because it might just feel that to the reader that you're inconsistent, that you don't have your own voice. But if you find elements that this educational tone fits, that some other departure tone. It doesn't have to be this particular type of departure. It doesn't have to be moving from poetic to educational. It can be moving from like languid and peaceful to horrific. It can be any sudden, sharp, jarring note that breaks up from previous rhythm. That works really well. You just, again, it's something, the previous one with brevity, it's harder to overuse that at the sentence level, at the paragraph level. That's one that you can rely on again and again, and it's not going to feel too repetitive because it's very simple in how, as a part of how we communicate. This one is, because it stands out a little more, because it's such a sharp type of change, you probably can't rely on it as consistently and commonly, but you can use it, you know, once or twice a chapter, every now and again, and it'll have that effect. It'll make your point. Another thing you can do is repetition. The previous example kind of used the same thing in the first portion, and I'm actually drawing again from that same book for the second example. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known. That's the scene in Tale of Two Cities where the character is being moved to the gallows. He's about to die for someone who he considers to have a more worthwhile life. So it's a very emotionally charged scene. It's a scene of a person who's lived their entire life kind of as a waste, as a scoundrel, and now he's like, I am going to give up my life so this person who I view as something higher can live theirs. And it's tragic, and it's sorrowful, and he brings the focus to the character's experience and emotion by that repetition of far, 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 better thing, better rest. And it really stands out in the paragraph that is drawn from, that sentence is the one that matters, because the rest of the paragraph is, I mean, it's well written. Dickens is usually well written, but it's not particularly poetic or beautiful, and then that sentence really, really is. Another thing you can do is addressing the audience. You know, if you are reading a book, you know, you're just kind of like in descriptions, actions, whatever, and every now and again the reader can like step out and address the author can step out and address the reader directly. Call me Ishmael is how Moby Dick opens. And we notice that opening, it's used in all sorts of textbooks. It's a classic example of an opening phrase. And one of the reasons it's so noticeable is because it's the author going, hey, you, talking to you personally, particularly. If you do it particularly as a command, like call me Ishmael is, or as a question, which I think Poe does that a few times, where kind of like questions the reader, like, dear reader, I know C.S. Lewis does it a lot in Chronicles of Narnia, where he's writing for children and it's kind of like avuncular in tone and like, it sounds like, you know, you're sitting by the fire with Uncle Clive, and it's all very informal. And he'll ask the reader a question like, have you ever? Or, I mean, I know my dear reader would never do such, right? And those scenes draw the reader to a pause, they make you stop. And the main danger of this one would be the fact that it draws the reader to a stop, that it pulls them out. So this is something that you probably don't want to do during an action scene. You probably don't want to do it in the middle of a high tension emotional moment, a romantic scene or something. But in a descriptive scene or in a expository scene that's getting a little dull or a little long-winded, well, you can use something like this to all of a sudden break it up. To all of a sudden be like, hey, we're a little less formal now, or, you know, I'm engaging with you more directly now. And it can really help that way. It can draw emphasis to a particular element that you're pulling out to single out as a thing you're going to talk to the audience about rather than merely write about. Another thing it does really well is it takes advantage of human psychology, because we are wired to respond to certain sentence constructions as being addressed to us. We're used to people asking us questions. We're used to people giving us commands. And so this isn't just a good literary device, it's kind of a very basic psychological device where you're stepping momentarily almost outside of literature and just engaging with them as a person. and taking advantage of their psychological wiring to respond to that sort of phrasing directly. Another thing you can do, which is this one is a little more nuanced and could really easily be mixed with other things, but slipping into the limited POV of your character when you were previously primarily more distantly third person. Main example of this one that I would go to is Game of Thrones. So Game of Thrones is written by an omniscient third person narrator, but each time that you're with a particular character, it will slip into a closer perspective now and then where the narrator will suddenly adopt the internal monologue and internal thoughts of the character you're following. And you really attach a lot of importance to that. It might partly be because when I read, or when I consumed a Game of Thrones, I did it for audiobook rather than for reading. And so you can really hear the narrator like cues in on this sentence is this in this character's voice. But it works the same way on a page. It's just much more noticeable when it's done by a narrator. And the advantage of this is that the narrator might be impartial, or he might have his own skew, but it's going to be different from the character you're following. And so if you're going along in the narrator's voice, following along in that style, and then you slide without warning, without declaring you're doing so, you just slide into the perspective of that character you're following, you're going to immediately attach, okay, there's more importance here because I'm not just being told what's happening anymore. I'm also being told what this person feels about what's happening or thinks about what's happening. And so there's immediately an additional layer of meaning added, and that will help add emphasis because again, you're engaging the reader's mind, making them think a little more, making them process it on 2 levels instead of 1. And so that can add a lot of emphasis to certain things. This is really good for making moral observations or for working on your themes, because it often feels very preachy if a third-person narrator starts making declarations about what they think is right or wrong in a story, or what they think the end meaning of something is. But if you can get your character to do the dirty work for you, it doesn't feel pretentious anymore because you're engaging with that character's perspective. And personally, I like to work a lot of themes in my writing. I like to work a lot of ideas and meanings in my writing, but I try not to do it as much in my narrator voice because it will come off as preachy or pretentious, or the reader, if they disagree with the thought, might feel combative. But if you're empathizing with the character who's thinking these things, it's much more easy to process them and think about them in a detached way and go, okay, well, I'm going to relate to this thought because I am relating to this character. And it's non-combative. It's I'm going to say lectorial because that's just it's not a word, but I think it makes sense. You know, it's like you're not lecturing, you're exploring character together with the reader. So those are kind of all the ones that I wanted to cover for ways to add emphasis with prose. And moving from prose, the next one would be doing it mechanically with grammar. So now it's not just how you write or what you write, but it's how you construct your sentences and how you use syntax to develop thoughts. There's some that are just like really big that are just like hammer blows, and some of those are italics. So if you put a word in italics, the reader automatically knows there's emphasis added here, there's a reason for that. That's one that has been used pretty heavily in some works and then almost not at all in others. I think it was more popular in the past than it is currently in a lot of writing. I'll be honest, most of my writing is from people who are dead, so I'm not the expert on current genre trends. But I think that you will find that one preferred a little more in like, I don't know, the 90s and the 80s perhaps than now. But if you use that sparingly, again, a lot of these are things that can be used sparingly. It can be very useful because sometimes you just have a word that's not really particularly fancy looking by itself, or that are a thought that's just not really, the only way to express it is simply, it's just a simple thing. But it's important to what the character's feeling, or it's important to something happening in the story, or it's a little bit of foreshadowing. You just want the reader to inflect it a little differently in their mind. And you might be able to slip in some italics there, and it'll be enough. Another way is fragments. This is one that I really enjoy using. This is one that, so long as you're not obnoxious and doing it like more fragments than sentences, it's one that you're fairly safe from overusing. If you're doing like just a stuttering fragment, it's going to be obnoxious. But it's not one that's immediately overused. You can use it a few times in the same paragraph, and it's not going to stick out as weird or awkward. Because it's very naturally part of how we speak. If you listen to or read a transcript of somebody giving a lecture or something, you will find so many sentences that begin and kind of like move on for a while and trail off into nothing, and then a fragment. And you only see it in the transcript. You don't hear it when you're speaking, because it's just how I communicate. And so fragments are very, very natural. They feel normal. They're not something that immediately is like dragging a halt to everything. But they are also different from standard structured sentence, because when you're writing, you're more formal. You're not using the same amount of breaks as you would in verbal discourse. So it works. It does draw attention, but it's not obnoxious about it. Another thing you can do, I think I mentioned this one already earlier, was isolating a single sentence as its own paragraph. That's another one that's kind of a hammer. It's heavy, it's on the nose. You don't want to do it a lot, but it can work. Another one is cleft sentences, which is a little more of a, requires a little more description. But if you have multiple subjects or objects in a sentence, the cleft sentence pairs off one from the others structurally. So let's go with this sentence. Frederick rode with Richard and Philip on the Third Crusade. It's a very simple sentence. We learned that 3 kings rode together on 1 crusade. Well, say it was Frederick who rode with Richard and Philip. It was Frederick who rode with Richard and Philip on the Third Crusade. Because you've taken that structure and added it was Frederick who, now you have one singular subject, and then Richard and Philip are just accessories to the subject of your sentence. And so if you're talking to somebody and they're like talking about Richard and Philip, and they can't remember who the third guy was, like, well, it was Frederick. That's how it works in communication, conversation, but in writing, if you want to emphasize as a reminder a particular element of the sentence, or state that it was this one specifically more importantly than the other two, you would use this cleft sentence structure to detach the one and make that your sole subject. Second, if you wanted to emphasize the crusade instead of any one of the 3 original subjects, you could say it was the Third Crusade that Frederick wrote on with Richard and Philip. Now you've made Third Crusade your subject, and you emphasize that one as distinct from the other numbered crusades rather than any one of those 3 kings. And then earlier we talked about fragments. The Third Crusade, period. Philip, Richard, and Frederick wrote together. It just adds a different layer of nuance. It makes the reader read that more slowly to have that full stop in the middle. So if you've got something that's kind of rolling along kind of rapid, and you almost feel like your paragraph is snowballing or something, well, that fragment there is going to slow down the pace. And you still communicate all the same information. It's almost the same. It probably is almost exactly the same word count as the first example. But it's slower, and it adds emphasis to that Third Crusade phrase, because now it's its own thought with its own full stop. So here's an example for kind of incorporating a bunch of the stuff we've gone over. And after this example, we'll do some works together and kind of like develop our own paragraphs. So for the sake of identifying many of the above techniques, let's look at a snippet of writing from a current project I'm working on. She looked down at her mother's hand that had once been so strong. It was thin now, with canyons plunging between its metacarpals, no meat visible at all. Metacarpals, that was one of the new words, the ugly words. The words that crept into Mara's life in the wake of the creeping illness, the sneaking cough, the loss of appetite, the growing hours her mother spent in bed, more now than she spent awake. The new words came in books, thick leather books with strange titles like Medigate the Court by N.A. Thwarting Ingwe in an Age of Reason. So you got a lot of different things here. One of the most noticeable is the sharp departure in vocabulary, where you start with a child's perspective, you use words like strong, thin, and then all of a sudden you got metacarpals. Where does metacarpals come from? That's a medical term. Why is this kid talking about or thinking about metacarpals? Well, it's one of the new words that comes from these books, and it's kind of like exploring this intrusion that's happened in this character's life, and the shift to using that medical language is a cue to the shift that's happening in the child, and it adds emphasis to the fact that this shift is important. There's a lot of repetition as well. So the new words, the ugly words, the words that are like that phrase, the words, used over and over again, crept in the wake of the creeping. Books, thick leather books. Each of these repetitions adds a little bit of rhythm, and it also adds an emphasis to the individual elements. And you have a lot of suspensive sentence structure here, a lot of dependent phrases building upon each other. And it's less obvious, but like the fact that you have a period after awake in the second to last line, and then the new words came in books. Even though that new words came in books sentence goes on to be quite long, it starts with a very simple active sentence, just subject, verb sentence, no fanciness to it, that initial statement. And so that kind of shifts the pace away from that previous suspensive sentence structure with all the modifiers and stuff, and lets you slow down at the end. In addition to the repetition of words, you'll notice that there are occurring use of adjectives and appositive phrases that make a pattern. Okay, at the end of the paragraph, we should shift away from that. So it's just discussing, sorry. If I wanted to emphasize the things already in the rhythm, instead of making that shift at the last sentence, I could continue the paragraph with another suspensive sentence structure, and that would kind of maintain the focus on what came before rather than shifting the focus to the shorter sentence at the end. So if you didn't want to have that emphasis, you could not have the shifting pattern, you could just continue the previous pattern. So let's do an exercise together. I'm going to take this paragraph. You should all have it. There are 4 men wandered in a forest. They followed a deer path they believed was made by men. The trees were green and healthy from a rainy spring. The men were green as well. They wore silk and velvet. They knew nothing about the dangers of thorns and brambles. The paragraph is pretty ugly. There is some rhythm and quality to the sentence. The men were green as well. A kind of poetry to the repetition and brevity. But other than that one saving grace, it's pretty rough. As it stands, the paragraph ends talking about the danger to the men's clothing from the thorns, while just kind of glossing over the fact that the men are lost, following the wrong kind of path, which is really a far more dangerous and important detail. So what I'd like you guys to do is take that paragraph, rewrite it to emphasize the danger that the people are in. Feel free to cut out edited extraneous details in there. Feel free to add new details or perspectives if you wish to enrich it. But try to consciously use a couple of the techniques we talked about on the previous pages. They're all numbered or bullet pointed. And then at the end, make note of which ones you used, and we can discuss some of the examples you guys come up with. So I'll just pause here for a few minutes for you guys to do that, and we can see what you come up with. Does anybody have one finished? All right, want to go ahead and share?
The pain, the ribbing, stabbing, and stinging. Each thorn or bramble that struck them reminded the men not only were they ill prepared for this adventure, they were lost.
Yes, so I'm going to key in immediately on the fragment at the beginning, heavy emphasis right there out the gate on what the sensation you want in the paragraph is, the pain, period. And then you move on. Were there any other things you were going for there?
I tried to string, that second sentence tries to string some things together, and then going back to the end of the sentence, it's very fragmentary, and that punchy, they were lost at the end was kind of that one. It's not set off. I didn't set it off as a second sentence, or a second sentence, I set it off by ellipses.
Yeah, so it's a few different things, you know, a change in the pace, use of a fragment, placement at the beginning and at the end. So yeah, a few different methods all worked in there, and it works. It's effective. Anybody else have one? All right, so I will cue in on, so at the bottom of the page, I have an example of how I rewrote it. Four men wandered in a forest, dressed in silks and velvets, wholly unfit to the malice of brambles and briars, as green to woodcraft as they were, as the deep green canopy above them. They followed a deer path, assuming that paths meant men and that men meant salvation, ignorant of their own ignorance. Went for a lot of repetition, kind of like rhyming elements, rhyming descriptions, and then ended on probably the clearest example of that as the last element. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. There's a lot of different things you can do. That last comma after salvation, you can make that a period, and then that would even more emphasize that short bit at the end as like standing out, because it would be its own fragmentary sentence. You could use italics if you wanted to in one or two places here. Like if you italicized assuming, it would add just a little bit of like, ooh, you know, like assume, you know. There's a few different things that kind of hint at the danger. The fact that you don't explicitly spell out, but rather leave assuming ignorant and ignorance to kind of like convey the danger, also engages the reader to have to think about it a little bit more, and that might add more emphasis to the danger than even if I had spelled it out more. So there's a lot of different methods. There's all kinds of different things you can shift and tweak here to make it heavier or lighter on different elements. And this was just one way of doing it. Like I've done this, the same example paragraph two other times, because I've done this editing class at the other Nerd Street events. And one person, they took this paragraph and they wrote the entire thing from the perspective of a deer watching them out. And it was lovely. It was a good example of lateral thinking, of stepping outside the boundaries of what they saw established and adding emphasis through another perspective. So there's a lot of different things like that. Have anybody finished that they would like to share now, or you know some of them?
Matthew and his three companions had been following a suspicious path for a while, but had all the markings of a normal deer path, but something felt off. The lush forest, overgrown from a raised grave, seemed to match the green clothes. However, their soft velvet and silk was out of place amongst the lush graves.
Any particular types you were going for to add emphasis to any portion of the paragraph?
I was trying to imitate like the putting the name and emphasizing a little bit at the beginning.
Yeah.
Left sentence, and just the longer kind of writing sentence.
Yeah, and that's something that I didn't mention, but it's also very, very true that including a name is its own form of emphasis. You know, because like we're cued in to empathize with characters, we're cued in to identify with people, and so when you have a name, it's probably going to stand out much more than a title or a pronoun or something. Like, you know, in Matthew, it's going to be a lot stronger than he. He is going to be a lot stronger than the village carpenter. You know, like the closer you get to the person rather than a vague description of them, the more it's going to emphasize that person. And that could be good or bad, depending on what you want to do. Like if you're trying to draw attention to what happens to a side character, you might not want to use their name. You might want to use the town drunk or the cobbler or something, some generic title that puts the emphasis on the event happening to them rather than the person. But if you want the reader to feel for the person, you're probably going to say Matthew. You're probably going to use their name. You might still say the cobbler and the town drunk to give them identity if the reader doesn't know who they are previously. But adding in their name is a cue that, you know, the reader as a person is going to empathize more and needs to be in touch with what this person experienced. So yeah, totally good technique. So exercise 2, we're going to take the makings of a paragraph. What are we writing about? Oh, awesome. Somebody give me a character to write about. Could be anything. Just a generic character.
Like a fairy?
All right, a fairy. And you guys also write this down because you're going to need this info too. Where is this fairy?
In a tree.
Is it a guy or girl?
Let's say girl.
Just because I have male pronouns written down in the example and I'm like not consistent. What is she doing? And this is open for all four of you guys. Like anybody can input information here. So you're just coming back.
Sorry.
Yep, you're good. We're doing the next page, exercise 2,
Yep.
and I'm going to take the makings of a paragraph and quick break one out, choosing something to emphasize. So we have the character is a female fairy. The location is a tree. Now somebody needs to give me something that this character is doing.
Watching a rabbit.
Why?
There's a lot of rabbits.
Why are they watching a rabbit? I'm not just being obtuse, that was the next question here.
Maybe it's a baby rabbit.
All right, so they just think it's cute. All right, what of those 4 things do we want to emphasize? Do we want to emphasize the location, character, what they're doing, or why they're doing it? All right, what they're doing. So you can, for your own use, just write out a basic sentence or whatever. I think you probably already kind of have, just like labeling each of those elements, what it is as a sentence, as a statement of fact. So there is a female fairy. She is sitting in a tree. She is watching a rabbit because she thinks it's cute. Then take those facts, those random bits of information that are arranged in a recognizable pattern, and write them in a way that draws some kind of emphasis to what exactly the character is doing. This is a much more peaceful example than the last time. By the way, I think the last time we wound up with Darth Vader fighting with a Waffle House employee because his food was cold. So this is much more peaceable, happy crowd here.
Well, that's ironic because the paragraph I'm writing is going to not be useful.
Perfect, there you go. Because I have female fairy characters in my books, I'm going to use my own names. interesting thing about this paragraph I found was watching is a fairly passive activity, and there's nothing like inherently dramatic about the details given. So choosing to emphasize what the character was doing, I think was probably the hardest of the 4 things, which is interesting. Like, you know, when you look at different paragraphs that are conveying different things, there's going to be challenges inherent to the particular context. So in this case, the motivation would have been really easy to emphasize because it could be very easily, I know this fellow says he's not doing a sweet, gentle, or nice scene, but it would be very easy to do a sweet or gentle scene that emphasizes the fairy is watching this happy little bunny. It would also be very easy to emphasize what the character is, because a fairy is an unfamiliar, strange thing that is, in essence of itself, fairly magical and wonderful. And so it would be very easy to emphasize the aspect of who the character is. It would also be fairly easy to emphasize the way they're at, because describing forests is often a very pleasant type of writing, and it's very easy to get into a flow of kind of describing what the setting looks like. But because it's such a passive, simple activity the character's doing, keying in on the activity itself is probably the most difficult of the 4. So does anybody have anything to share? Let's hear it.
Istich watched the core. The hunter stopped short, taking care to stay no closer to the glade. He saw her, sitting in the upper branches of a rotting oak. Her smile was as dark as her raven hair. His gaze followed hers, and he gasped. She was watching a rabbit, watching it with the same ravenous hunger that the dog might have bone, his daughter her bottle, or Siegfried his tank of ale. But what scared him, what shook him in his boots, was that the rabbit she watched with such malicious glee was where Robert had stood seconds before.
I love that. Like, clearly you got the repetition of the phrasing that had emphasis on watching. You introduce new characters and hinted at backgrounds much broader than your prompt. It was great. Any particular things you wanted to mention as far as how you were
Obviously,
going for emphasis?
so repetition. I tried to like place her where she was, and point out, like this is not a good fairy.
Yeah.
This
That's
is
not
not
Carrie.
the cute,
That
fluffy,
Carrie.
This is not the cute, fluffy scene that we. Like, I mean, I have that happen. I tend to take the obvious prompt and go the exact opposite direction.
Which is lovely. So, anybody else want to share? Alright. It's usually easier because there's usually just a few more people, and so you're able to kind of like spread out interactions. Nobody feels picked upon or singled out, but we'll keep on going. So mine was Brandirial sat astride the little holly branch, green eyes wide. The little form below hopped nervously forward, nose twitching, alert and cautious. She watched. She didn't know why, but that's a nice thing about being a fairy. Nobody expects you to have reasons. She just watched. So it's placement at the end, repetition of the 2 phrases, moving from she watched to she just watched. They're also the 2 shortest sentences, so there's a few different things that draw emphasis to it. One could make the case to argue that there's a little more emphasis on the motivation than the actual action there, but there's a lot of bleed over that all just kind of like carries together, and I think the general activity receives a pretty good amount of the limelight. So if nobody else wanted to share, we can move on to the second section of the pamphlet. So we've talked about how to add emphasis throughout everything so far. Now we're going to move from how to why. So when would you pick one of these elements to emphasize? What benefits are you going to gain from it? And so when you're editing, what things are going to motivate you to make the choices that you make for these changes? There are layers to how we convey information in writing, and there are reasons for what we emphasize and what we hide. We may obfuscate certain things to prepare for a reveal. Brandon Sanderson loves to do this in the last 100 pages of his writing. Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie do the same in their mystery stories, and I think a mystery story is kind of a quintessential example of obfuscating certain details to reveal at the end and then kind of like pile on how things were pointing in that direction. But it's used in all genres for different purposes and in different ways. These choices we make are a large part of what will give us a voice in our writing. Word choice and grammar and syntax play a part as well, especially in works like, say, A Clockwork Orange or something, where there is a very strong voice and almost like a distinct vocabulary created for the piece. Like in those spaces, grammar and word choice and syntax, huge. But that's kind of beyond the scope of just a single panel discussion. So we'll focus on how particularly emphasis plays into your voice and how to edit for it that way. There are different levels of clarity in every statement we make in writing. A simple statement of fact. You're a reliable narrator, you tell the truth, this happened, boom, done. Indication of fact. You might do this by saying the exact opposite of what is true. Oscar Wilde is really good at this. Scott Fitzgerald is really good at this, where you make a patently absurd statement to emphasize the opposite of what you're saying. And it is often delightful when done well. It could be frustrating if done poorly, but it's very, very delightful to read because it just tickles that little part of your brain that wants to contradict, that wants to disagree. But you're expected to, you're supposed to, it's part of the experience. So that's a really good way of stating something if you want to be a little tongue-in-cheek or be a little artful or something. You can just indicate it in different ways. You can leave off finishing details that the reader should be able to grasp from context. This allows the reader to add their own weight to the statement because they had to get to it by adding implications. So yeah, just like leave off a little detail that should be inherently obvious from the context clues of the sentence. You can use any infinite number of ways of indirectly communicating your point. Think of the meme, tell me your ex without telling me your ex. You know, it's like tell me from Wisconsin without telling me you're from Wisconsin. Tell me you're a Royal Race fan. You know, you make statements that are not a statement of the fact that you're conveying, but they convey that fact more readily than their actual literal meaning. Hints of what may be foreshadowed, what might be, things you don't actually say or even imply, but also pointedly do not dismiss. Oftentimes when you're writing or when you're reading, there are certain details that are expected to be countermanded or expected to be assured as not the case. So like, you know, you've got some dangerous thing going on in your sci-fi story and, you know, there's a threat of something that might happen and you pointedly don't say that that's not the case. You pointedly don't reassure the reader. And you're not saying it will, but Chekhov's gun is hanging on the wall and, you know, it just might be going off in the third act. So those hints and those foreshadows that can be done without ever saying them. None of these levels are correct or incorrect. All three will be used in tandem. You might use all three in the same paragraph. They're just a way of describing different ways of communicating things. Different readers will use more and less of each one. Tolkien would be very much statements of fact, a lot of statements of fact. Oscar Wilde would be almost entirely indications, with some hints also. So it kind of depends on what kind of mood you're setting. It kind of depends on what kind of relationship you want to have with the reader, which one of these three you will rely on more. But they're all very important things that will almost always exist in every chapter, you know, often on every page. Points of view is another way. So you have the levels of clarity, and then you have points of view. Who is conveying particular facts? You have three main types. Third person omniscient, think Lord of the Rings, picture Dorian Gray, the Three Musketeers. You're the god of your little world, you know all, you see all, you're in every mind, you're just like laying it out for it because you have access to all details. Then there's third person limited. This is more Wheel of Time, Brandon Sanderson, Game of Thrones. This, not always, but often in fantasy, this one will be used for multiple POV stories, so we have a lot of main characters that you follow in different chapters and stuff. It's very, very popular for that. You may only know what is known by one character in each scene. So you can tell, so as the narrator, you're telling exactly what is happening in the third person voice, but the only mind you step into, the only observations you borrow, the only feelings you indulge in are those of the particular POV character you're following. And then you have first person. Huckleberry Finn, Great Gatsby, A Clockwork Orange. You're telling the story as if you were there, as if you were a participant. I think we're all pretty familiar with, the distinction between third person and first person. So unlike levels of clarity, you will usually pick one of these and stick through it throughout your whole work. There might be exceptions for artistic reasons. You might have, a journal entry or something that switches into first person, or you might have a story where you want certain portions to be in first person, and so you invent a in-world or in-narrative framing device for why that's the case. But usually it's going to be one of the three. Another thing is the levels of certainty. So you have levels of clarity, points of view, and levels of certainty. How well does the narrator know the facts he's conveying? One, you have the reliable narrator. Again, that's Lord of the Rings and Tolkien. That's the person who knows everything, is just giving you the facts. Then you have unreliable narrators of a few different types. Think Wuthering Heights or The Picture of Dorian Gray. We don't quite know if the character is telling you the truth. You don't quite know if the character knows everything. They're just explaining it from their perspective. And there's a few different types. There's the misinformed narrator. That's The Wheel of Time and The Great Gatsby, where the main character doesn't know everything and he has been lied to. So he's telling you the story and he's getting things wrong because he doesn't know any better, or he directly knows wrong. Wheel of Time is a really good example of this, because that was one of Robert Jordan's primary motivations for writing the series, was to explore how in a civilization before fast communication, how stories and information would distort over distance and over time. So the further amount of distance that there is between each of his characters, the more time that passes without them interacting, the more distorted the perspectives of each other become. You get these characters who are super close friends in book one, who are deeply mistrustful and hesitant of each other throughout the later books because they are misinformed, they're getting the wrong information, they're separated, they don't know the full story, and it's a very interesting thing that he plays with. The Great Gatsby is another really good example, because the main character, Nick, is getting to run around by multiple different characters throughout the book, and he only kind of like gets the full picture towards the end as he gets more elements of story filtering in to kind of fill in the gaps. But like Gatsby isn't really who he says he is. Daisy is a very, very deeply flawed person with a lot of shallow motivations. Her husband is a intellectually deficient individual who plays at being an intellect, and each one of those three characters kind of twists the fabric of what the story looks like around themselves, and that misinforms the narrator, so that the story he's telling you has little ifs and wrinkles and stuff throughout it. So that's the misinformed one. There's also the clueless narrator. This one, it's not that he knows facts that are incorrect, he just doesn't know. Game of Thrones is a really good example of this. Many mystery novels are a great example of this, because in Game of Thrones you have huge cast of characters interact with different stories, similar to how I said Wheel of Time earlier. Lots of distance between them, they don't know what's going on. Over here, they're just isolated in their own little perspective. So, you might have like all the threat with the White Walkers in the north that these other characters in the south have no idea about, and because of that, their scope is limited and they can't tell you everything. A third type is the insane narrator. This would be like Lovecraft or Fight Club, where you think it's a reliable narrator, supposedly, but then things start falling apart, reality crashes in, the elements that other characters perceive in the story kind of like contradict what this person is expressing. Poe played with this too. I would think probably the Sixth Sense could kind of be categorized in this. Like, the character's not insane necessarily, but his perception of reality is completely out of whack with what's actually real around him, and he is like unable to observe reality objectively. So you have an insane narrator who his perspective is distorted, and so he's giving you a distorted perspective, and it's only when reality comes crashing in on it so harshly and there's no denying it anymore that the character is able to like open up and reveal what the actual world is. So all of these things contribute to deciding what you want to emphasize and why, and all of those help to build your voice as a writer. So how do we decide which of the above options to use? The levels of clarity will probably all be used at one point or another in the same story, sometimes in the same paragraph, no matter which other options you choose. But the other two are more subtle. You will choose a POV and stick to it. And your narrator will be either reliable or unreliable. There are not things you'll need to ask. These are not things you'll need to ask during editing. They will be decided before you write. But keeping them in mind will inform how you edit and rewrite and why you emphasize what you do and why you choose different levels of clarity. So here's some questions to ask about your chosen narrator as you edit. How does your narrator voice differ from your own? What do you know that he or she doesn't? What does he or she know that you don't? How educated is your narrator? What specific insights does your narrator have into the characters you're writing about? What is important to your narrator that he or she will emphasize naturally that wouldn't necessarily occur to you? An example, let's all write a paragraph together. We have 4 facts as a basis. A man, Edwin, is approaching a medieval-style flour mill with a cart full of grain for the miller to grind. He resents the miller's role as tax collector, taking a portion of all the grain he grinds for the local baron. Later in the story, the man will murder the miller over an accusation of skimming and be hanged for it. The day is maddeningly hot. We correct this any number of ways. Let's do it like so. Edwin sighed and rubbed his sweating back against the boards of his wagon, eyeing the grotesque massive walls and roof and spinning wheel that was the mill. He hated this place, hated the man who ran it. He had not yet killed him, but he would, all in time. It was too hot to deal with Trevor the miller, too hot to squabble over tax rates and weights and measures. All the info is there, it's all very clear. Level of clarity is statements of fact with a bit of foreshadowing hints also. The narrator type is a reliable, point of view, third-person omniscient. Nothing too specific is revealed about the person narrating, except perhaps that he's a bit dry and cold about death. He doesn't value suspense very much, just kind of gives things away. Let's take the new spin. Let's write it out with the murder only foreshadowed or hinted at, not stated. So our second or third level of clarity. Let's use an unreliable narrator who hates the miller. Let's go with third person limited using Edwin's knowledge only, making him our de facto protagonist. He's a farmer who knows nothing about farming, or excuse me, he's a farmer who knows about farming, but little about milling or taxes or government. So that should inform our voice. We know what he knows that we don't, we know what we know that he doesn't. We know his feelings towards the other character in the scene, and we know that we only want to foreshadow or hint at the death. We don't want to give away this big pivotal plot moment so early. Edwin sighed and scratched his sweating back against the boards of his wagon, stretching like one of his pigs against the corner of its rough-hewn pen. He eyed the mill ahead of him distrustfully, cursed, ugly thing, all cogs and spinners and ropes and wheels. He knew there were specific tricks to that machinery, special slots in those spinning stones inside that sifted off his flour and hidden troughs, robbed him of his proper reward. His sacks always came back so light. God's above it was hot. He saw Trevor's beady eyes glaring out behind a glass-paned window, one of so few such windows in the village, and he felt a rage, the old rage building inside. He was not violent there, but God's knew. God's knew. So there's a lot here that kind of like is specific to this character in this moment. The simile about stretching like a pig against one of the corners of the wood. I mean, not every person would use that comparison. It's kind of it's not crass, but it's just kind of a rough hewn comparison. You know, you don't really like to think about yourself as compared to a pig. But for a character who's a farmer who has the visuals around him all the time, he might just think about things in those terms. So using our limited third-person perspective, even though we're not quite in his mind, we're kind of adopting his language and his world, his mannerisms to craft our similes. Presumes the opinions of the limited perspective as fact. You don't write that the narrator thinks the place is cursed and ugly. If you were writing third-person omniscient, you would write Edwin thought the place was cursed and ugly. But working in third-person limited, you just state it, and that slips you immediately into that character's perspective, and the audience cues in on it very naturally. So that's actually a very helpful tip aside from just like particularly editing, just writing in general. If you're doing the third person limited, if you want the reader to feel what the character is feeling, or think what the character is feeling, or understand the character a little better, don't say this character thought this. Just state their thought as fact, and it will really help the voice of that character shine through when you do that. So cursed, ugly thing, all cogs and spinners and ropes and wheels. This also illustrates his lack of knowledge. He's a farmer. He doesn't know anything about, how exactly this mill functions. He views it as just all these contraptions and elements kind of fumbling together in some mystical way, not mystical really, but to him just kind of like outside of his ken or outside of what he cares to know about. Then at the end you have the hint or foreshadowing of the violence. This is probably the point of emphasis in the paragraph. It's made so by its position at the end, its repetition of phrases, and the trailing off ellipses that kind of like linger and make a statement feel incomplete. The reader mull on it because they want the statement to be complete, but it's not. So there's a few different techniques there at the end used to make the emphasis that God's needed. There's also an inherent threat in that unfinishedness that foreshadows the coming violence. So obviously the decisions we're making here are not all decisions you'll be making fresh during editing. These will be decided before while you're doing the writing. So you're not going to be necessarily thinking in the same terms we're thinking right now when you're editing. You're not going to be thinking, okay, am I being an unreliable narrator here, or am I being reliable? Those will kind of be decided. But if you're editing and you feel like a paragraph is stagnant, or you feel like you've lost touch with your voice or something like that is going on, these will be some really good clues of how that might have happened. If you go, okay, well, if I'm in third person limited, am I writing as if I'm in third person omniscient? Am I distancing myself from my character and saying things like he thought? Or if you're writing in third person omniscient and you feel like your story is suddenly in somebody else's voice, you can go, well, am I slipping into that character's mind a little bit? Am I not using those distancing phrases? Or if you're writing in first person, am I letting my knowledge as an author slip into this person's perspective who wouldn't have that knowledge? Or am I not giving them the knowledge they would have? One thing that I've always kind of found a struggle in writing is writing super smart characters. Because, I like to think I'm decently intelligent, but I'm not a brainiac. I'm not a genius. I'm not some savant. And so if I'm writing a story that involves somebody who is supposedly all those things, who is supposedly so much better or more intelligent than myself, I have to create ways to illustrate things that are outside of my knowledge base. And that's a trap that is very easy to fall into. I love Brandon Sanderson, but I think this is actually an example of something that I found very frustrating in some of his novels. Where, like, in his Mistborn series, he has a character named Ellen Venture, who's supposed to be extraordinarily intelligent and well-read and a great thinker and philosopher and strategist and politician and all these things. And basically the way that Brandon Sanderson conveys all those things is by saying, Ellen Venture is a brilliant philosopher, he's a great strategist, he was so smart, and everybody said, yes sir, that was such a smart observation, well done. And it's frustrating to read. It makes it feel cheap, it makes it feel fake, it makes it feel like you're not getting the genuine article in this character. And when that character, spoilers, gets it, I felt nothing. It was like one of the least emotional, impactful moments in a series that I've read that has so much build up to it. It's 3 books long, and this character is with you just about the entire journey. And in the last few pages he dies, and I felt nothing. And I think it's because I felt cheated the whole time that character was around, because all of the things that defined him were explained to me rather than shown to me through his actions. And so these are all good questions to ask yourself, like, am I just giving my perspective as a person, or am I giving the perspective of this narrator, of this character that I have? And all of these things will feed into your editing process when you hit those places where you feel like your voice is faltered, or you feel like your perspective has dropped away. And I think this just turned off. So yeah. Ask us.
The battery operated.
Ah,
That's
probably.
a long panel, try the other.
Yep. Oh, there you go. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so obviously the decisions we're making here, right now. So if you're writing from third person limited, so ask yourself which elements should be stated outright and which should be hinted at. Do you want suspense built up before the murder? Why are you emphasizing what you emphasize? Why are details left out? We'll do one more exercise, and that'll be the last one. Let's make another simple paragraph. You guys all give me some more details. Give me who are we writing about?
Robot.
Robot. What's his name? Or designation, or title?
Beta 7.3.
Beta 7. Where is he? Can be anything. Just shout out a location.
Alaska.
Alaska. Perfect. What is he doing?
Hunting.
Hunting. All right. And why? What is his motivation in a particular moment?
The scientist wants something different to eat.
All right. So gathering for his creator. And what is the POV of this? Are we writing from the third person? Are we writing from the robot's perspective? What are we doing? Let's go first person. All right, so we have a robot. His name is Beta 75. He is in Alaska. He is hunting because he needs to gather food for his creator, and we are writing from his perspective in first person. What do we want to emphasize? Or, excuse me, let's go to the next steps. Is the narrator reliable? Is Beta 75 a reliable narrator? Is he telling us the truth or no?
No, he's not telling us the truth because his batteries are wearing out.
Okay, so I think that would fall under mostly kind of the insane, where it's like his perspective is detached from reality. He's that form of unreliable narrator. Would this character have any special information or expertise that would influence how they write this paragraph? If they're a robot, I would assume they would probably have a pretty wide range of knowledge and information. So you can assume that whatever they're communicating would be fairly knowledgeable, albeit his battery's running out, so it might be a little garbled. What techniques will we use to emphasize our focal point? Well, you can use whatever you want. Make one of these details a hint or indication instead of a statement. So one of the things here you can maybe just kind of like hint at or be a little less direct about at some point. Now let's go ahead and write that paragraph. and pick anything. Go for it.
Another day, another snowy waste. Dr. Miller needs something new. The rations are stale, she said. Boring. Flavorless. Meat made a 75. She said, I need meat. But does she do it herself? Does she risk the cold, the snow, the animals? No, of course not. I do. I get wet, my joints rust and freeze. But does she care? Never. A thick mass fell against the ground, indicating his work was done. He scooped up the grain and put it in the bag. Judging that he had enough, he left the house, not noticing the shivering child among his corpses as he returned home to his master.
You're a sick person. I love it.
The doctor says,
Oh, okay, gotcha. I like the, like, you never said that he killed a person. That is very obvious he did. And, like, yeah, that was the hint at a detail. And you had the perspective, you had the, was there any element in particular that was unreliable?
he is not telling you the truth about who he's working for.
Gotcha. Nailed it. Yeah, so anybody else want to share?
Snowden's vision made it difficult to confirm that at this distance, the animals seemed to match his criteria. Nature's database, plenty of mass, with quadrupedal and sometimes bipedal. Data 73 tallied and scored and prompted him to decide as his new target. His reaction was instant. Almost as soon as the target was confirmed, he shot the ground down a pre-computed course with the same conclusion. Creature's responses almost sounded structured, almost like creators.
I couldn't quite hear the last few words there.
What was the last part?
Was that
What was the last part that you heard?
just like the last sentence? I couldn't quite hear.
The creature's response almost sounded structured, almost like the way that the creator addressed it.
Nice.
So he killed
Yeah.
David.
Yeah. So same thing. Like you're hinting at like the failing memory and processing power, so you can't quite recognize what's the correct prey, and then you kind of hint that it's a human, but it's not. Perfect. Yeah. Nailed all the elements that you're looking for. Both of you had very distinct voices, but both were consistent voices. I kind of went a very similar route with mine, where it's like, okay, his processor's failing, it's something prey, maybe he misidentifies it. I stepped forward, my joints squealed in protest, my pistons groaned. I was not made for Alaskan cold, where nights drop to, and I just have a blank there because this character would have information that I don't have. So I put a blank there, and then later when I have time, I Google how cold does it get in Alaska at night, and I put in the information that the character has that I'm lacking. But father was hungry, and the salt pork no longer satisfied. Though it had the calories he needed, we had the robotic perspective on sustenance. I saw my prey, though it had the, I saw my prey, large, shaggy brown, long claws. My data banks struggled to identify a giant sloth. Safe enough. Good, he's about to get ball beggars in there. So yeah, it's all of these things play into the editing process where you're looking for the maintenance of a specific voice, you're looking for elements to emphasize that carry the particular portions of the story that you need. And when you deal with these broad stroke ideas, oftentimes the smaller issues will kind of smooth out of their own accord. And it's a really helpful approach. Like there's nothing about what I've discussed here that's like specifically the way to edit. But if you approach with these things in mind and kind of gear your work towards achieving these specific ends, a lot of the minute issues will just kind of evaporate because where they came from was an uncertainty in the way things were written first. So like when something is staccato or lagging, like I said at the start, and something is clunky or repetitive or overwordy, oftentimes if you just ask yourself, is this my character's voice? Am I being consistent with how they would express this? Am I not inserting myself instead of the narrator voice I've established? Or if you ask yourself, am I emphasizing the wrong thing in this sentence? If I move this detail from the beginning to the end or from the center to the beginning, or if I'm make this sentence more of a suspensive structure with multiple phrases instead of individual sentences. Will doing that be enough to fix the focus and make everything else kind of flow smoothly? So yeah, that's all I had for you guys. Thanks for coming. I hope it was enjoyable. It was interesting. Let's get in touch. If you'd like, there is a QR code here you are welcome to scan, and then if you scan that, you can download any of the videos for the rest of the Writers Track panel here. And I think it also includes ones for the panel events at Des Moines Con as well. And if you scan it though and input your email, it will also allow any of the panelists who took part in these panels to add you to the mailing lists, which you can obviously unsubscribe from if you desire. But basically, if you scan that, you'll have access to all the videos, and then you'll also be added to mailing lists for the authors who gave those panels.
Did you say Des Moines?
Des Moines Con. It's put on by the same people who do this one. They do one in Minneapolis called Twin Cities Con, and they do one in Des Moines called Des Moines Con.
Des Moines, Iowa.
Yep.
Now I think with that last story, it's gonna fight from it, and the robot that is created dead. And the robot's just continuing to rotate and killing the village slowly. So he's crazy.
So you got something to do when you get home.
I think I do. I also think the fairy story might actually be interesting too.
I really liked your, for a paragraph written in 3 minutes off the cuff. I liked that very story paragraph. That was fun.
I've graded. My problem is I've graded ideas. I can't finish it. In fact, I have a short story about that I can't finish.
Thank you all for coming. So,
Thank you.
what sort of stuff do you guys all work on?
I'm actually writing a portal fantasy novel, which doesn't actually have fairies in it, but has beings that are very similar to fairies. Although said beings are actually the villains.
You ever teach at a technical school or anything online?
Yeah, like that. Yeah.
So like people just hire you to go over their stuff?
I don't do any work as an editor. This is like a writer. I sell my work and stuff, and I took, I majored in writing in college. I took a lot of class editing and stuff in college, and then I just do these workshops.
Yeah, it's fun listening to it. How bad I am. When you get to hear someone knows what they're doing, it's really interesting.
I'm glad I fooled you guys in the thing I do it.
All right.
And if any of you guys are curious, feel free to check out my booth at D4 and say hi. You're more than welcome.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Selling anything, any books?
Yeah, got a couple fantasy series.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, I love doing these. There's a lot.
All right. Well.
Yeah.
I know. I feel like this is really tight. Oh my god, if you know. No, we don't have okay, I might just make out a bathroom. Okay. Just making more nice stuff. Share the bathroom? Yeah. Okay, I got it. Okay. I gotta get the, I gotta get a battery. I gotta get a battery, I'll be right back.
The curse of your panels always coincide with my lunch. I always catch one. I know. Or are we streaming? I thought that was your setup. No, my setup's right here. Oh, right here. Okay. Yeah, 3. Yeah. So I was like, that's it for StreamYard. Not trying to startle anybody, but can y'all hear me okay? Do I need a microphone?
I hear you.
Okay. Sweet.
So we got.
I've been texting Dave, but he hasn't gotten back to me. It's,
Boys. 9:15, 2 o'clock.
Cool. I don't know if you want to, or what you're up to tonight, but I think at 9, we're gonna do Gundam, do a small
The the signs that point later.
The only thing I know is I think I'm getting dinner with you.
Okay. Yeah, I have to go doing something, but we haven't figured anything out yet. Sounds like it's just a new station. I don't know. Yeah. Hey, Red.
My friend left his camera. You want to be recorded?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
That's actually what I'm setting up right now.